Hello, welcome to this video lesson designed to help you understand the poem Ozymandias. As this is part of a series of video lessons, I'm going to start by outlining how to use them and why you're learning about poetry before we actually move on to the poem itself. So, how to use these videos? Well, first of all, I would recommend having the poem with you. If you haven't got your physical copy, then you can always get a second copy, maybe print it out from the GCSE English Revision Drive. You'll be able to find it in the folder Lit Paper 2, Power and Conflict Poetry, and it's just there. When you're annotating in your anthology, what I recommend you do is make sure that you are annotating in a way that will help you in the future, because everything you put in there is revision, and you will need it later in the year, especially when you're preparing for your exams. Because of that, make sure that you are clear, detailed, write small, try and save space, and color coding is recommended, so make sure that you can see the different themes. Work at your own pace is a big advantage of a video lesson. So you can pause things, you can skip forward. If you need to rewind, you can. So make sure you use that wisely. So why are you studying poems and an inspector calls? So you are doing 2 GCSEs for English. After year 11, you'll leave with 2 of them. One is language and the other is literature. Each of these have two exams. So just like language, literature has 2. And on literature paper 2, section A is going to be an inspector calls, section B is going to be power and conflict poetry, and section C is going to be unseen poetry. So essentially you're preparing for that paper. Power and conflict poetry then, so the section B bit. For this part of the exam, you will be given one of the poems, and you must explore how it presents themes. You also, in your answer, have to link this to another poem of your choice from the anthology. So basically, knowing the poems well is vitally important. The better that you know them, the easier you'll find this section. Don't worry though, people generally do quite well. So, Ozymandias background information. So let's move on to the poem. In order to fully understand a poem, you need to understand the situation, the background context. You don't actually get marks for a lot of the things that I'm about to say, but they will help you understand the poem itself. So, Ozymandias. This is what the Greeks called Ramses II, who was one of the most powerful ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Don't know what a pharaoh was. They were like kings, but had absolute power. They had slaves, maybe hundreds of wives, and they definitely had hundreds of children. Essentially, they were completely unrivaled. Ancient Egyptian monuments and artwork can date back to 3000 BC, so we're talking 5,000 years ago. But Ozymandias was born in around 1304 BC, so it's a little more recent. Ozymandias, like many other pharaohs and leaders with absolute power, was cruel and selfish. He was also obsessed with his legacy, which I'll define in a second, and wanted monuments built so that his power would always be remembered. Legacy basically means the way that people want to be seen after they've gone. It's the Ozymandias was obsessed with how people would see him and his power all throughout time, not just while he was alive. So skip forward hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's much closer to when the Victorian period was, just a little bit before. In 1817, fragments of one of these monuments were found in the Egyptian deserts. The writer of this poem, Percy Shelley, was inspired by this. Shelley was a romantic poet, which doesn't mean what you'd think it would mean. It basically means he valued the simple beauty of life, simple things in life, and nature as well, above things like technology, which it was during the Industrial Revolution, greed and social advancement. So he had values, like many other poets, some of them will be in the anthology, that favored simplicity, beauty, nature. So the whole poem basically focuses around the image of what remains of Ozymandias and his legacy and what time and nature has actually done to it. When reading the poem, we're about to read it, it's important to understand these lines. 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. This image is exactly what it means. So if you can imagine that throughout the poem, it does make it a lot easier to understand. When reading a poem, remember to take your time, read it slowly and carefully. Don't put pressure on yourself to understand it straight away. Read to the punctuation, which I'll show you in a second. Reread it if you need. It's likely that you will need to reread it. And remember that there are lots of revision guides and things on the internet to help you if you don't understand. So, Ozymandias. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So when we're trying to understand a poem, we need to think about the basic contexts. So the who, what, where, when, and why, and how. And if you know those, chances are you understand the poem. So we're going to start off with who. On the first line, we get a couple of people. I, since it's the speaker who's saying I, we can probably assume that it's Percy Shelley himself saying this. So the speaker initially is I. But the speaker meets a traveller, and the traveller is the person who tells the story. All of this, look, you'll notice in the quotation mark there and the quotation mark here, the majority of the poem is actually what the traveller told the speaker. So that's two people already. Another person in it is the sculptor. The focus of the poem is largely the actual monument itself, and therefore Percy Shelley focuses a lot on the sculptor who made it. Obviously, Ozymandias is part of it. And ye mighty, what that phrase means is basically all other kings and powerful people in the world, all other rulers. When and where should be fairly easy. We already kind of know. So when I met a traveller, if we assume that Shelley is the speaker, then it would have been around 1818. But it also goes into the past. If we think about some of the things that are being said about Ozymandias, then these clues suggest it's actually set, in at least part of it, set in ancient Egypt. And we know that it's in the desert, which is where most of the Egyptian monuments will be. So what is the poem actually about? You can break this poem down into fairly basic steps. Ozymandias is about the speaker who meets a traveller, and then the traveller tells him about a statue in the desert. The statue is old and ruined, but it still has expression of disgust and cruelty on it. Ozymandias was a powerful ruler. He believed he was more powerful than any other man, like a god. And that's where we're at this bit now. But then the poem ends with this. But now there is nothing left of other than some of the remains of the statue. It's completely isolated. They are the four basic things that this poem's about. So how has it been made? So this is where we talk about the form of the poem. When we talk about form, we're basically talking about the type. What kind of text is it? In this case, it's 14 lines long, so it's a bit of a clue that it's a sonnet. However, it is a little unusual. It can be divided into three parts: two descriptions of Ozymandias, split between a focus on the sculptor. There's no regular rhyme scheme, which is a little unusual. Does this reflect how easily toppled structures like the statue of Ozymandias can be? So, if it's taking away the structure of rhymes in a sonnet, is that a metaphor almost for how easily Ozymandias' own statue was toppled? Told from a second-hand account, that basically means that the speaker has heard it from a traveller who has discovered it thousands of years after it has already been crumbled and destroyed. That just emphasizes how forgotten Ozymandias has become. And all of his things, all of his arts, all artwork, all of his monuments have become so forgotten. And the fact that we hear it from someone who has heard it from someone else emphasizes that. A really important part of understanding the context of a poem is why. Why has it been made? What are the key messages? And for this, to get the higher marks, you need to be thinking about something called the human condition. And that phrase isn't really as difficult as it sounds. All it means is, what are we learning about what it is to be a human? What is it saying about life? What is it saying about human nature? So usually poems will explore things like who we are as individuals. They'll explore things like the decisions that we make, the relationships that we have, what we go through in life, the temporary and fragile nature of life, and just the feelings and the morals that we have. When it comes to Ozymandias, then, I met a traveller from an antique land. Well, we don't get much morality from the speaker himself, but then if we go throughout the poem, there are lessons that we learn. So here are some of them. Having power only creates a desire for more power. That's definitely something we learn about human nature through Ozymandias himself. It's not enough for him to be powerful. He wants to be above all humanity. He wanted to be remembered forever. Power can corrupt morality. We see that he is a cruel leader. His cold command, the alliteration of cold and command there, emphasizing his leadership was abusive. Life is temporary and quick. Well, we see lots of examples of what life was like for him when he was alive, but the poem ends when he's been dead for thousands of years, emphasizes how quick his power came and went. No man is greater than time and nature. I think that's probably the biggest one. The end of the poem emphasizes that no matter how, even though Ozymandias believed he was all powerful, more powerful than anyone in the world, what's left of him now? Nothing. Nothing beside remains. The tiny things that have been crumbled down over thousands of years that used to be his great monument. Poor leadership and cruelty will not result in a lasting legacy. Perhaps the reason why he has been so forgotten is because of how poor a leader he was, how terrible and cruel a leader he was. And skill and craft will be celebrated more than power. There's a certain irony in this poem that the sculptor actually is more celebrated by Shelley than Ozymandias himself. We'll have a look at that in a second. So the next step is to understand themes. So a theme is a recurring idea throughout a text which supports the thoughts, purposes, and messages of the writer. There usually will be 2 or 3 bits of evidence in a poem that will help you analyze a theme, that will help you look at what this theme is and what the theme's saying. The key themes in this poem are time and nature, which you've probably already realized, art and skill through the sculptor, and power, pride, and legacy through Ozymandias. So, on to analysing these themes then. The first one that we're going to start with is time and nature. So, how has time and nature been presented in this poem? The first step is to pick out the evidence, anything at all that is saying anything about time and or nature. So, I'm going to bring up on the screen the different quotes that, to me, represent any sort of message about time and nature. The step after that, after you've got the evidence, is to actually analyze them, to zoom in on the key words, phrases, or features that Shelley chose when he was writing the poem. So, for example, antique land. I met a traveller from an antique land. So this traveller had come from a land that is described as being antique. Now, that adjective emphasizes the amount of time since Ozymandias' life. Antique emphasizes that it's old and forgotten, but also maybe precious and delicate when we know that it's delicate because it's crumbled away. Then we've got trunkless, shattered, decay, colossal wreck. Over time, the monument has crumbled and broken, and that's what these words tell us. These adjectives, trunkless, shattered, and there's nothing left at all because there was no one to take care of it. This could be a metaphor for Ozymandias and his legacy, as he has also been forgotten, just like his statue. So just once again, it's a metaphor because, like his statue, Ozymandias' legacy has crumbled away over time. So it's almost like this statue represents Ozymandias himself and his legacy. Nothing beside remains. So the rest of Ozymandias' legacy is gone, fully eroded and covered by the desert and its might. The verb remains also reminds us of death. Now we've also got the caesura. And remember, caesura is when we have a pause within a line. This is the caesura, the full stop here that makes us pause after remains. So when we're reading this line, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Shelley intended us to have a pause here and here. And what that does is it emphasizes this phrase, nothing beside remains. So the caesura after remains emphasizes the end of Ozymandias' legacy. We're forced to really stick at the word remains, which is reminiscent of death. Now, finally, we have got the alliteration of boundless and bare and lone and level. Boundless and bare just means without limits, so it's incredibly large and empty. And then lone and level just means alone and flat. From these final lines, then, they emphasize how isolated this wreck is from the rest of humanity. The alliteration, boundless and bare, lone and level, makes it sound like it is completely alone, this wreck. And therefore, metaphorically, it helps support the idea of how forgotten Ozymandias has become. It helps highlight the messages about life that we explored earlier, about time and nature being more powerful than any man and that kind of stuff. Right, moving on to art and skill. So we pick out our evidence. These are the quotes that I think in any way relate to the theme of art and skill. You'll notice that a couple of these are actually from the last theme as well. That's fine. Sometimes you'll have lines of poetry that will relate to several different themes. So, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. I suppose the only thing to say really there about art and skill is that the sculptor who made this statue has managed to capture the tiny details of Ozymandias and his expressions. So the frown, the wrinkled lip, the sneer of cold command, these are things that the traveller, who when he saw this wreck, he was able to recognize these tiny details about Ozymandias' character through the skill of the sculptor. Tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive. That's the important bit, which yet survive. So the only thing that's still alive of Ozymandias' legacy now, that's still around to be recognized, is this particular statue. So the sculptor had more of a lasting legacy than Ozymandias, you could say. Shelley highlights the skill over the power of Ozymandias. It's actually praising the sculptor. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, the heart that fed. So there's a couple of different ways you can see this line, but I think that if we're going to think about art and skill, mocked, the verb mocked, doesn't necessarily have to mean to take advantage of someone. It doesn't have to mean to make fun of someone. It could also mean to imitate, to create an imitation. So mocked in this line could have two meanings, but it most likely means that he created an imitation. Interestingly, though, we've got the heart that fed. What did Ozymandias feed on? Is this what we normally associate with hearts, or is it more about the alternative meaning? We'll come back onto that later. But basically, again, it's celebrating the little details that the sculptor managed to craft while making this monument. So nothing beside remains again. So the only remnant from that era is the lasting skill of the sculptor. Everything else is gone. Remains could have a double meaning, as we've already discussed. The literal, where there's nothing left, but also it reminds us of death. It weakens the previous power and authority of Ozymandias, and then celebrates the fact that the statue that the sculptor made has lasted. Finally, onto power, pride, and legacy. So here's the evidence that I think is worthy of discussion when we talk about this theme. So, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command? The word choices evoke, which basically just means bring to mind, disgust at his people, but also absolute confidence. He had such confidence in his own power that He looked out among his people and looked at them in disgust. Remember, a lot of these slaves making these monuments would have suffered and lived their entire lives just so he could have this monument. So there was no sort of um, grace, there was no being grateful, there was nothing like that. The tiny details on the face emphasize the cruelty of Ozymandias, the cold command, as we discussed earlier, the alliteration of cold command. He was heartless. That's what the adjective cold tells us. He was a heartless leader. But also, if you think about it, this monument was designed as a way of showing off to everyone else in the world, which we'll touch on more later. And he wanted people to see that he had a wrinkled lip, cold command. He wanted to be known this way. So the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. We've already said earlier that this could actually have a double meaning. The alternative reading of this is that Ozymandias was cruel to his people and his slaves. So mocked in this sense could mean that he made fun of them. And when it says fed, this could actually mean that he grew more powerful from them. I suppose in a sense that could mean he grew more powerful because his land and his monuments grew because of his people. And on his pedestal, which is basically like a platform, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. The phrase King of Kings is very interesting here because it makes him sound like he believes he is greater than any king alive, so he's above all rulers, and therefore it makes him sound like he believed that he was godlike, he was beyond human. Look on my works, ye mighty. So he wanted all other powerful rulers to look at what he'd achieved. And despair, the verb despair means feel a miserable sense of hopelessness, that their own legacies could never compete with his. So I suppose it wasn't enough for him to just be powerful. He wanted to be above everyone else. But then, as we've said before, the ending of the poem is all about making Ozymandias seem insignificant. So no matter what he achieved, no matter how much power he had, no matter how strong his legacy was in his mind, ultimately it led to nothing. It was insignificant. No matter how powerful he once was, no man can compete with the vast power and scope of time and nature. And that's Ozymandias. So if you need more help with that, if anything wasn't clear, if it was too quick or anything like that, I didn't actually talk about a lot of different things. It was just a quick overview. There are things that you can do. So if you go back to your GCSE English revision drive, there's lots of resources on there. There's guides for each poem. There's obviously going to be breakdown videos as well for the other poems if you need them. If you're unsure, remember to ask your teachers. They're the experts. So email them if you're struggling. And then there are some useful websites. Genius.com is really good. What it does is if you hover over a word or phrase in the poem, it will annotate it for you and it gives you information about the key words and what people have thought about the meanings and things like that. It's really good. So if you just type into Google Genius Ozymandias, it'd come up. SparkNotes and Shmoop are also good revision websites. They walk you through the steps needed to understand the text. And then there's also BBC Bitesize and YouTube, which have useful videos as well. I hope that was really useful and that you understand Ozymandias more now. Thanks for listening.